Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome on this warm and beautiful summer's day in Geneva. Before I start any substantive comment, I would just like to thank the WTO for allowing us the use of these facilities by the very kind grace of the mission of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, who made this arrangement possible for us. We are absolutely delighted to be able to have this extremely timely meeting on this extremely important topic today, and I really would like to thank all of you for turning out to join in this discussion. We feel that at ICTSD this is a pivotal moment in the path towards the MC10 in Nairobi at the end of the year, and there are so many really important events that affect the prospects for Africa on the way. And we just felt that we could not but take the opportunity of the launching of the Tripartite FTA on the 10th, in fact, just a few weeks ago, in Sharm el-Sheikh, to take a little punctuation point, to stop and look at this event and say, this process, it's more than an event, is what does it mean for us? And what are the opportunities and what are the challenges? We recognize now that the dynamic in Africa is fast-paced and is growing. This is a continent with a growing population, i.e. a growing source of consumers. It's a continent with fast-growing economies. And it's a continent that embodies the spirit of dynamism and the search for sustainable and inclusive economic growth that we are all looking towards. We feel that it has the potential to be this microcosm of example of looking at issues and events and processes that could be very interesting to the entire globe, that it has grown beyond looking at only preferential arrangements as part of its vision for sustainable and inclusive economic growth, to looking at arrangements with emerging economies and, more importantly, the dynamic within Africa itself. So we are delighted today to have this discussion. We hope that you will join in most actively. The discussion is basically divided into two sections. The first section, we will look at the TFTA, try to understand it, and Zadwa will give us some kind of introduction as to what exactly it comprises and what's at stake here. We will then turn to Patrick Kanimbo to try to understand how we can move forward in implementation in the next phase and in addressing the institutional challenges inherent. And then finally gain, most importantly, a private sector perspective from Oswald Benha, so that we understand who are the real stakeholders here, who are the real engines and drivers of economic development. And I think that will give us a nice breadth of perspective around the TFTA. We will then have a very short session of discussion and a brief coffee break, and then move to understanding what are the implications and prospects for the continent-wide approach, which will be led by my very good friend and colleague, Darlington Mwapi. So, if I may start, Sadwa, please take it away.
Thank you, Deborah. My colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. We are still excited as the Tripartite Task Force after the launch of the TFTA in Sharm el-Sheikh some 19 days ago. There's a lot of questions, obviously, and it is expected, and I'm hoping that this audience will raise the necessary questions that you can take to our superiors as we go back to the Secretariat, especially myself as I represent the Tripartite Task Force. My presentation will focus mainly on what the TFTA agreement entails, what the process has been since we started the negotiations in 2011, and what the challenges have been. I won't dwell much on the challenges, but I will just highlight some of them that may require some thinking going forward, especially now that you are moving to phase 2 negotiations and the CFTA negotiations. Africa TFTA, a key milestone for continental integration. The background to the TFTA, I won't dwell much on it, but I just want to give you a synopsis of what the TFTA entails and where we started. It's by far the largest FTA in Africa that covers 26 countries. From down in South Africa, and I like the quoting that it's from Cape to Cairo, because you start trading from the Cape of Good Hope to the Mediterranean Sea up in Egypt. It combines a population of 632 million people with a gross domestic product of $1.3 trillion. What is important about the TFTA, it is that it is going to be the launchpad for the Continental Free Trade Area. So whatever happens, the decision makers, ourselves who are coordinating the process, we have to make sure that it is a success. The whole idea was mooted in 2008 when the summit heads of state of the three RECs met in Uganda in 2008. They directed their secretariats of COMESA, EAC, and SADC to fast-track the attainment of the African Economic Community. And this was to be achieved through, merging the three RECs to form one grand FTA, which we now call the Tripartite FTA. But the ultimate objective is to establish a single customs union. The main aim of the TFTA is to contribute to economic growth, alleviate poverty, and attain sustainable economic development. So it's much broader than just trading. When Summit met again in June of 2011 in Johannesburg, South Africa, they launched the negotiations. What is key to that meeting is that they adopted a developmental approach to the negotiations. They didn't want to focus just on the market integration pillar, but they introduced two other pillars on which the TFTA is anchored. This is the infrastructure development and industrial development. Later in my presentation, I will explain why really they wanted the TFTA to focus on those other pillars in addition to market integration. They also took a decisive step to achieve the African vision. There has been so many attempts towards regional integration in Africa. You have the Lagos Plan of Action of 1980, the Abuja Treaty of 1991, and the AU Summit of 2006, which all talked about the African Economic Union. Phase one of the TFTA agreement covers goods, and it had to be undertaken together with negotiations on the movement of business persons. And then we've heard recently the third tripartite summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, where 16 heads of state signed and opened the signature for signature by others, the tripartite FTA. 16 heads of state signed, but as of today, we have been informed as the Secretariat that Angola, Zambia, and Mauritius are ready for signing. So basically it means by mid-July we will have 19 of the 26 member states having signed the TFTA agreement. The summit of Sharm el-Sheikh also directed the commencement of phase two negotiations that will cover trade and services and other trade-related matters such as competition policy, intellectual property rights, and investment, cross-border investments. They also prioritized, they directed the prioritization of program of work on the industrial pillar and infrastructure development. I think the main question people are asking is, why is this different from the other attempts? Our view is that the TFTA is different in many ways. The first is the developmental approach which the heads of state took when they launched the TFTA. It recognizes the need to address supply-side constraints. Africa has entered into many trade agreements, but when you look at the performance, even the global performance of the continent, it is very disappointing, largely because of supply-side constraints, hence the need to develop the industrial base of the tripartite region. It also recognizes that there are some infrastructure gaps on the ground. When you compare the cost of moving goods, especially for the inland countries, they are quite high. So the infrastructure will help towards addressing those issues. The second point is that it brings together 3 regs that are already implementing a tripartite free trade areas. You have COMESA, which started implementing its FTA in year 2000. It launched the TFTA in 2000. As we speak, 15 of the 19 countries are implementing the TFTA. You have the EAC, which has even moved further. They are now a customs union, and they are implementing a free trade arrangement. And then you have SADC, which launched its FTA in 2008, and already that implementation is taking place. So in our view, it shouldn't be really difficult for the 3 regs to come together and implement an FTA that encompasses the 26 countries. The last point is that it addresses some of the key challenges, which, in my view, perhaps the previous attempt sort of ignored them. It addresses the issue of overlapping membership. You have quite a number of the countries within the tripartite that are participating in more than one reg. It also looks at contributing towards economic growth and alleviation of poverty. So in my view, it's much broader than just trade. So there are other targets that it aims to achieve. Now we move to the process. Negotiations started in December 2011 in Nairobi. Unfortunately, a substantial amount of time was wasted on non-negotiation issues. For instance, how are we going to identify observers? How are we going to define the 11 principles of negotiations that were adopted by summit? So a lot of time was really spent on the text-based negotiations. Only began in May of 2013 in Kigali during the 7th meeting of the Trade Negotiating Forum. So perhaps a lesson that can be learned from by the CFTA negotiators. There's no need to be spending so much time on the logistical issues. So when the negotiations were launched, we were given a time frame of 24 to 36 months. That deadline was missed. Obviously, it was meant to be June of 2014. The TFTA was only launched in June of 2015. Even then, we still have, I think, 2 critical annexes that need to be finalized before you can effectively implement the TFTA. The modalities for tariff negotiations and rules of origin. I just want to highlight some of the mistakes that were made. The modalities were less ambitious. They were not ambitious at all. That is what was agreed in Livingston, I think, in early 2013. They agreed that upon entry into force of the agreement, 60 to 85 tariff lines would be liberalized. And this poses a challenge, really, because even among the tripartite member states, you have countries that are fairly liberalized, like Mauritius, with about 86.7% of their MFN tariffs at 0%. You have countries like Seychelles, which fall within the same categories. Even SACU, the Southern African Customs Union, which seems to be more conservative in the negotiations. They have 57% of their tariff lines at 0% MFN. So basically, if you're saying you will open up 60 to 85, and if you were to say you will open 60%, that basically means you're opening only 3% of your trade, which is not, it's not encouraging. So that's the first mistake that was made. But on the other hand, you have countries that have fairly made good offers. Mauritius, for instance, has made their offer known by everyone. They've offered 100% to all tripartite member states that are participating in an FTA, which basically means they are ready to trade upon end when the agreement is ready for implementation. And for those countries, and let me just say, out of the 26 countries, you have 22 that are already participating in an FTA. The only 4 countries that are not implementing any free trade area is Angola, DR Congo, Eritrea, and Ethiopia. So a country like Mauritius has said, for those countries that are not yet participating in an FTA, we are offering them 90%, subject to reciprocity. And 10 other COMESA member states have said we are offering all tripartite member states the COMESA acquis, which is 100%. And definitely that is subject to reciprocity. So you do have countries on the one hand that are quite conservative, and you have others that are quite ready to implement the agreement, to enter into the TFTA. On the movement of business persons, that was a separate track that went, the negotiations were in parallel with the trade in goods. It started quite late because of logistical issues. Again, there were questions around where are we going to place this agreement? Will it be part of the TFTA or it will have a separate instrument? But at the end, it was agreed that it will have a separate instrument. A couple of meetings have been held, and when a presentation was made to the ministerial committee, they just told us that what you are offering, what is entailed in that instrument is more stringent than what is currently being applied. So you go back and review. So we are hoping that we will have a more liberal sort of instrument on the movement of business persons. The agreement itself has 45 articles, which covers areas such as tariff liberalization, NTBs, SPS, TBT, rules of origin, customs cooperation, among others. And then in terms of the accompanying annexes, we have 10 annexes, 7 of which have been finalized. The 3 that are outstanding is Annex 1 on Annex 1 on tariff schedules, Annex 2 on trade remedies, and Annex 4 on rules of origin. Annex 2, it's not an issue really because we do have an interim arrangement. What will apply whilst we're still finalizing. But the major problem will be with Annex 1 on Annex 4, which are critical for the implementation of the annex. And I've highlighted what the problems were when it comes to tariff offers and rules of origin. But what is important for me is what on the outstanding issues. What delayed us is the option to negotiate list rules as opposed to having simpler rules of origin or even a general rule across. The issue of tariff schedules, this would be informed largely by the outcome of the negotiations on tariffs. So member states are really not confident on rushing to finalize their tariff schedule without finalizing rules of origin. So the two will sort of inform what happens to the other. With the rules of origin, as I've said, there is no issue. In concluding, Chair, which I know my time is up, although there is that work that is outstanding on phase 1, our view is that The launch of the TFTA marks a significant step towards Africa's integration efforts. And perhaps as a parting shot, I'll just like to remind participants of the cover story of the Economist magazine some time back, some 10 years back, which said Africa, the dark continent. And then quite recently, the Economist has heard a cover topic for Africa saying Africa rising. So for me, really, if we have the optimism and the determination to make the TFTA work, we can do it. And also, it is important that we do not allow such great ideas to be driven by individuals. As Africa, we do need to build very strong institutions that will drive our integration efforts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sadra. And that actually leads very nicely into Patrick's presentation on the institutions, institutional challenges and implementation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Deborah, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll be very quick because I think some of the parts of my presentation were covered by the most appropriate person to do that, and that's Zodwa, who's actually involved in the process of negotiating this tripartite. So she mentioned about the Cape to Cairo, and there's just a graphic there which shows you the area covered by this tripartite agreement is pretty much more than half of the continent, more than 58% of the continent's GDP, and 57% of the continent's population. A key message there is that we know that Africa, the whole thing about Africa Unite started at the time of independence, but I think during this time of globalization, the imperative cannot be greater. It's now much of a necessity to integrate economically, because as African countries of small markets, they cannot really compete on the global scale. They need to consolidate their markets and be able to attract investment, market-seeking investment to take advantage of this growing market, the Africa Rising story. And again, this slide presented some of the timelines which Zodo has touched on, but I think for me the key thing is that there has been some targets that were set at the beginning, and those targets were missed, even though not by too many years, but nevertheless, there was some issues with regard to sticking to the timelines. And when coming to implementation, those things, they will then come to bear. So implementation challenges will stem from the fact that the agreement, even though it was launched, the free trade area was launched in Sharm el-Sheikh, but it seems to me like moving into a house that hasn't been finished, like many people do in my country. I don't know about you. They'll build a house, put a floor, a roof above it, maybe no windows, etc., but they'll move in nevertheless. It's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be comfortable living in that house. So until you put all the finishing touches, you cannot really say you've got a complete house. So the issues that are outstanding may actually hinder implementation. You have a free trade area, but you haven't agreed on the rules of origin. How do you implement? You haven't agreed on the trade remedies and the tariff schedules. So those issues mean that even though the launch took place, the countries cannot move full speed ahead into implementation unless they have agreement on those issues. And I'm glad that the optimistic view is that within a year they'll finalize negotiations in those areas. Hopefully that's going to be the case. My colleague there is very optimistic. So let's all be optimistic. But nevertheless, we need to point those things out, that these are issues that need to be looked at. And then we have the phase 2 issues. The agreement, the process identified a phase 2, which is going to look at other areas such as trading services, competition policy, intellectual property, cooperation in trade development, and cross-border investment. I think the key point there is that member states of the tripartite are not homogeneous. They are different in many ways. Some of them are services-oriented economies. Some of them are very aggressive in seeking markets for investment. Some of them are net exporters. Some of them are net importers, etc. So these divergent interests might actually affect their commitment to implementation in as long as the full package of issues hasn't been negotiated and agreed upon. Then the second set of issues are the institutional issues. Key amongst those is the issue of matching ambition and resources. What we've seen is that members, we have the 3 regs, SADC, COMESA, and EAC, and they receive subventions from member states. Those contributions from their member states, they mainly go to the operational areas to pay the staff and run the secretariats. When it comes to development programs to implement the integration agenda, most of it is funded by international cooperating partners, and that's been the reality in Africa for most African regs. But this is a challenge to regional integration and continental integration, because as regs, you have agreed on a set of issues that you want to do. As member states, you have agreed that this is what you want, but you want somebody else to fund the implementation. And that somebody else has his or her own agenda, which may not necessarily match your own agenda. So for countries to really own the development process of their integration, they need to look at matching ambition and resources, putting their mouths, the hand where their mouth is. Right, and then there's the common issue of coordination challenges. We have 3 regs. Of course, the idea of this tripartite is to reduce those types of challenges. But in the absence of one body coordinating the issues, you may have coordination challenges. In the declaration of the Sharm el-Sheikh, there was mentioned by, I think, the Vice President of Kenya, to say that they are going to do everything possible to fund a secretariat for the TFTA. So this would help coordination if it comes to fruition. And then there's the issue of institutional capacity weaknesses of the RMCs. Sorry, we tend to use RMCs at the bank, but these are just member states. We call them regional member states, member countries. As you know, even though these agreements are negotiated at regional level, implementation has to take place at the national level. And the national levels, they have serious implementation challenges, be it in terms of passing the laws and regulations that need to be put in place to implement, be it in terms of implementing the programs of the tripartite. So they have serious capacity issues that need to be looked at if this TFTA is going to be successful. And then there's the whole issue of domesticating commitments. It goes back to the issues I mentioned about now mainstreaming that into your development agenda, which you can then fund and run with. Then the last one is there's need for complementary investments in viable regional transport networks, energy, and TF measures. Zodwa mentioned that the TFTA is developmental in that it's not going to look just at at the market integration, but you look at these enablers like good infrastructure. But this is a big challenge. Africa as a whole, it faces a big deficit in terms of infrastructure. So any talk, any FTA that only covers the soft issues whilst ignoring these hard infrastructure issues is bound to face some difficulties in terms of translating into real results. So what can the bank do to support TFTA implementation? As you know, the bank is a catalytic financier, it's a strategic partner and a knowledge broker. But we work in a specific framework. So our framework for support is anchored around the 10-year strategy covering 2013 to 2022, which has 5 core operation areas: infrastructure development and regional integration, being one of those. And then below the regional integration, we have a specific regional integration policy and strategy, which was developed in consultation with all the RECs and some of the continental bodies like the AUC and the ECA. It looks at 2 core pillars: investing in regional infrastructure and enhancing trade and industrial development. And again, this is consistent with what our clients have told us that they demand as their priorities. And then we have a cross-cutting area of capacity building and mainstreaming sustainable development. Beyond that, for each region, we have divided the continent into 5 regions: North, South, East, Central, and West. We have programming documents that translates the repos into programming programs. And then at national level, we have the country strategy papers, which identify national level. The issue that we've faced is that sometimes there's misalignment between what the countries tell us at the national level and what we hear at the regional level in terms of what their priorities are for funding. So beyond that framework, we have specific instruments that we use to support implementation. At the top is the ADF, African Development Fund, which is a concessional window. It's replenished every 3 years, and the current basket is 5.4 billion UA, unit of account. 1 UA is about $1.5. And then in that window, we have specific envelope. The regional operations envelope is earmarked for regional operations, and it's 21% of the full basket. So that's about 1.1 billion UA in 3 years. And then we have the performance-based allocations, mainly for member countries and not regional borders. And then we have a basket for fragile states. All these are concessional windows. And then we have the African Development Bank window, which is non-concessional. It really focuses on the middle-income countries that are able to borrow on these commercial terms, as well as the private sector, both in the low-income and middle-income countries. And then we have some thematic funds, one of which is the African Trade Fund, specifically targeting trade development. And then we deploy those resources towards capacity building, knowledge products, advocacy, policy dialogue, infrastructure, both hard and soft, project preparation, and private sector. The next, so I'll just give some examples of what we've done in the tripartite. We've been a partner with the 3 RECs in this process. In 2014, the bank approved a grant of $7.5 million to design a project called the Tripartite Capacity Building Program. It focuses on 3 key areas: the market integration, capacity development, non-tariff measures, and industrial issues. And then it looks at industrial capacity development. So I will not go into the details, but it was very demand-driven, and it was developed in collaboration with the RECs themselves. Zodwa was one of the architects during the design stage. Right. So in other areas, we've also provided funding to the NEPAD Planning and Coordinating Agency, which looks at infrastructure, capacity building for infrastructure issues. And all the 8 RECs are benefiting, including the 3 tripartite RECs. And again, in terms of looking at investments in hard and soft infrastructure, the bank uses half of its loans and grants for investing in infrastructure. Last year, 2014, we invested 3.5 billion in infrastructure. That's one example of a road that we constructed in Kenya. It's the Thika Highway. And then the bank as a knowledge broker, we have several products that we can use to strengthen the process. First of all, we do flagship publications. The Assessing Regional Integration in Africa report is one of them. It comes out every year, if not 2 years. And then the African Development Report, which the last version of it was focused on regional integration. So those come up with some ideas that can be used, can be tapped on by these tripartite RECs. And then we have knowledge tools. We are in the process of designing a system of indicators to monitor regional integration in Africa. It's going to be more quantitative than the area report that I mentioned before. And we're doing this again with our partners, UNECA and AUC, African Union Commission. And then we'll do another knowledge product with McKinsey and Company and the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Councils to look at movement of talent, especially also looking at movement of business persons on the continent, and we'll be tracking who is doing what reforms to enable that to happen across the continent. And then we have a one-stop border pulse resource book, which we did with JICA and the Infrastructure Consortium for Africa. So in concluding, I would say that addressing the technical and institutional challenges in a timely manner is going to be key for implementing the TFTA. And designing of regional projects takes time and is complicated, so the coordination aspect is going to be key. Monitoring and communicating results is going to be vital. And then, of course, there's need for complementary investments in infrastructure, both hard and soft. So I would say the TFTA launch is an important milestone. It gives the process some political momentum, but member states need to match the ambition with resources. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick, for that note of caution, the balanced views. Oswald, give us the private sector perspectives on all of these things and more.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah. Mine is actually not going to be a very technical presentation, but also just to probably just spend a minute in terms of my introductory remark, to just say that I think there's a lot of conversation in the continent which says, can Africa trade itself out of poverty? For me, that becomes a key question. It's a key question in the context that for once, Africa has now diverted the conversation from deep political issues to economic issues, where economic thinking may eventually start to drive political processes. And I think this is going to enhance Africa's capacity to develop productive capacity and improve its industrial performances, and obviously driven by key areas, 3 key areas: technology, labor, and maybe the capital formation. Let me just bother you with a couple of statistics before I go into my presentation. Africa right now is home to a population of over 1 billion people. Yes, there are issues here and there, but I think we are averagely enjoying macroeconomic stability. And it's 3 times the size of China, which is also an emerging giant. 7 out of 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa. And this I can give you. This is an observation as between 2011 and 2015. Ethiopia, DR Congo, Tanzania, Nigeria, Ghana, and Mozambique. 18 top African companies have revenues topping $3 billion. And 41% of Africans are under the ages of 15%. So we have the youngest population. These statistics can go on and on and on. From a private sector perspective, we believe this presents a unique opportunity given the necessary political will. My presentation will look at those areas, but I think some of the areas have already been, ably been covered by Zodwa and Patrick here. And I certainly will not be able to touch on some of the areas that they have ably done. The TFTA and the CFTA are political positions by African heads of state and government. And that's a very key and important milestone. That then gives you the appetite of politics to be able to move into this great idea. And this is a great idea at the last bullet point of that slide, as long as it then looks at some of the issues that I'm going to highlight. And these are some of the comments that came from levels in UNECA and AU, and obviously the ADB from where Patrick comes. That's the formation of the TFTA. I think Zodwa has covered that. The economic impact of the CFTA in terms of implementation has 3 main pillars. And it's a tripartite strategy, and it's contained in the vision and strategy document endorsed in the second Tripartite Summit of 2011 as follows. It has got market integration, which will promote efficiencies as prices among different locations or related goods follow similar patterns over a long period of time. It also looks at infrastructure development, and there's still a huge infrastructure gap in Africa, which presents a huge opportunity. The gap is estimated to be it's over 90 billion. Due to our poor road networks, it will be very difficult to swiftly transport goods across Africa. And as private sector, this is an opportunity for critical regional or continental projects in terms of PPPs. More so, there will be storage costs, which leads to high cost cost price, and further reduce competitiveness of commodities. And these challenges certainly have made the continent very uncompetitive in terms of the local production of goods and services. The third pillar, obviously, is the industrial development pillar. The industrial development pillar is going to look at how to integrate Africa in the global value chains. And integrating Africa into global value chains is actually going to enable the continent to be much more at ease to discuss terms of trade with itself before they engage the outside world. So for me, that's the few economic issues that emanate from the implementation of the CFTA. According to the Regional Integration Resource Network in Southern Africa, these are aggregate welfare gains, and these are ambitious figures on the TFTA scenario in terms of percentages. You can see that Zimbabwe there, being one of the smallest and the laggards in terms of implementation, actually stands to benefit more than the other countries. So the issues of really trying to protect borders and all this really don't have room for discussion in terms of that from the private sector perspective. Success scenario of the Grand FTA in Africa. As private sector, we foresee that this is combining a complete tariff liberalization for intra-TFT trade with reduction in costs of border crossing trade within the TFT area. And that is equivalent to a 5 percentage points ad volume tariffs. Aggregate net traffic for the TFT group amounts to over 3.3 billion. And that's obviously nearly about 0.4% of aggregate baseline absorption, and more than 5 times the gains resulting from full intra-TFTA tariff liberalization alone. Total volume of intra-TFT trade is boosted by about $7.7 billion. That's a 20% increase. That's as per 2014 baseline indicator. Significant sectorial production effects with corresponding significant implications for employment concentrated in actual subsectors of African economies, actually moving from the tradition of primary goods to value-added goods, with forward and backward linkages in all areas, textiles, metals, chemicals, tobacco, and related farming products, you name them. So that's quite an ambitious and exciting development we foresee. Advantages of the CFTA implementation. I think it enhances intra-regional trade and investment. It increases, and benefit from price competitiveness. Every country is bound to benefit due to different areas of specialization, increased performance. And because FTAs engender specialization in goods and services in which the nation has comparative advantage, countries are able to take advantage of efficiencies generated from economies of scale and increased output. Variety and innovation. I think for the first time, Africa can be able to actually look at an issue of innovation as an integral part of planning economies. This will be a reality if African consumers access the wider variety of goods and increased competition. That will spur the companies into innovation and develop better products. Investment efficiencies. Currently we foresee an obtaining situation where every African company who wishes to access any level of investment, it's average 4 to 5% above a similar company outside the continent. So I think with a lot of effort in terms of implementation of the CFTA, we foresee some level of sanity in that regard, that we can be able to access cheap financing, and also looking at complementarities where companies are not strong in particular areas of production will be able to merge with companies within or outside the continent. FTAs can lock countries into economic and political reforms, particularly if those policies and rules are stipulated within the agreement. And that gives certainty for private sector if that spirit carries on like that. This I borrowed from a World Bank economist, which says that FTAs will enable Africa not only to enhance trade between countries on the continent, they may well create a web of positive interactions and interdependence, which is likely to build trust, raise the opportunity cost of war, and enhance reduce risk of conflicts between countries, which means as long as countries have converged on economic benefits in terms of the implementation, then certainly issues of chaos and other issues will be at a minimum. It makes economic sense to implement the FTAs. I'm a bit hesitant to look at those disadvantages. Why? Because there are still matters under discussion in most of the processes that UNECA and AU are looking at. And these are looking at the benefits and non-benefits that are emanating from the implementation. And from private sector side, I think we want to probably preeminent the issues of the advantages. Yes, we can be able to look at those and consider them as we do planning as private sector. Issues like increase in transaction costs. I think this is coming from where member states have to look at their comparative and competitive advantages and all that. Increased vulnerability to external shocks and many other implementing issues that come out on that. Allow me to just look at a reality check on CFTA implementation. The agreement stands as the largest in Africa with 3 different boards with different ideologies. How it is going to be consolidated and serve its purpose of integration. The formation of these boards differ. Some are politically motivated. The conclusion of the deal in Egypt will merely be the first step, and it will need to be approved by each country's parliament before wheels are set in motion in 2017. The TFTA, is it the ideal best practice that Africa has to look at? Or we need to look at every other customs union, free trade area that is around us? Is that the implementation practical in 2 years? Why we are excited about it as private sector is because the conversation has been set rolling. And whether 2 years, 3, 5, 10 years, I think the train has moved. Are we just talking? I think we've seen that the agreement has been signed. The political will is already. And obviously, we are worried about the continued use of the term national sovereignty in all the negotiations and discussions. I have attended meetings of experts, senior officials, and ministers in most of these processes since 2012. We continue to see a lot of national interest impeding discussions, and that becomes an issue when it comes to implementation. And in conclusion, the FTAs will give African consumers access to a wider variety of goods, and increased competition will spur companies to innovate and develop better products and to bring more and more goods and services to the market, keeping prices low and quality. And I think Africa needs this, not any other time, but at this point in time. Allow me to say that a comment from my colleague Zodwa on Africa being a dark continent to being a continent of opportunity is ideal. But I also want to say, Patrick indicated that Africa is moving into an incomplete house. Given. But it is better than not having a house at all. So here we are saying Africa has built a house, and we are moving in that. So we are actually asking our colleagues all over the world to engage with Africa as a potential, a key growth node in global economic discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oswald. At one point, I was a bit alarmed when you sort of had this table of disadvantages there. We talked about magnifying inequality, but thank goodness you got past that and said, okay, at least we have a house. We have some walls. We may not have the windows, but we have some walls. It's going somewhere. That was a really interesting set of presentations, and I wonder if anybody would like to kick off with some questions for our panel. Yes.
Thank you very much. Magdi Farhat is the name. Actually, they are not questions. There are some comments on the 3 presentations, and I beg my colleagues and brothers, sisters, forgiveness for being so forward and as to advise in some way. We seem to be confused from the 3 presentations about the CFTA and the TFTA and the customs union and the economic community, which is the end of the line, so to speak. There is a program set in motion by the heads of state. We have deadlines, and as the 3 speakers agreed, we are missing all the deadlines. In some ways, we are moving forward. I think Oswald was and Zodwa said that we are moving forward, but we are not moving forward fast enough. So that brings me to the second issue, and trying to adopt a slightly more innovative approach to negotiating these agreements, whether it's TFTA, CFTA, or other. I think if we borrow a leaf from the EPA book, Africa, North, South, East, West, etc., has been negotiating with the EU a full package of trade liberalization, where tariffs will be coming down to practically zero in longer or shorter periods of time. There are services annexes to these agreements. There are other parts related to competition, to consumer protection, to IPR, etc. So in a sense, we as Africans have already done the hard work with our friends from the EU. So if we just remove the title of EU and make it Africa, we are there in a sense. We wouldn't be losing too much. In fact, we would be gaining a lot of time. Secretariats. Having been part of government for the last 30-odd years and then with the UN for a few more years after that, I hate secretariats, and I'm sorry to say it. Please forgive me for those of you who are from any secretariat. The idea is if we create new secretariats, call it the TFTA secretariat, the CFTA secretariat, and so on, we are creating monsters that are hard to control. And I think, again, if we borrow a leaf from our European friends, they are fighting with their secretariat in more ways than one. So in a sense, I think the less secretariats we have, the better. I'll stop there in that respect.
How you can say this in the house of the WTO Secretariat, I don't know, but okay.
By the way, my wife works here, so don't worry. Corruption. None of the three colleagues has mentioned the word corruption, and I think it is still an issue that requires some attention on the African field. I wish the negotiation would address this issue one way or another. I don't know how, I don't presume to dictate, but I think if we can, and particularly I'm talking to our private sector colleague, if we can get the member states to discuss the issue and put together some sort of MOU, working mechanism, whatever you want to call it, I think, as Oswald was saying, our partners would be more than happy to provide the support that we need. And last item, and this I'm direct to my brother Oswald, is the private sector. As long as the private sector is not engaged on a day-to-day basis with these negotiations and pushes their government to do stuff, the government will not do it. And I'm not saying any particular country, all the way from the Cape to Cairo and to the West as well. If the business sector does not move it, the governments will not do it. So it's up to you to do the work. Thank you.
Right. Any other questions? Sherry?
Thank you so much to the three speakers for really, really interesting presentations. I listened very closely and with great interest, and I guess my question is, what is the relationship between the TFTA, which is the object of our discussion today, and the CFTA, which is the Continental, of course, Free Trade Area, or Africa, or Free Trade Agreement. So the basically continent-wide free trade agreement for all of the 53 members of the African Union. My understanding is that also was launched recently in Johannesburg with an actual deadline of June 2017. So it seems that these two very big and very ambitious set of negotiations are moving forward in parallel. That the TFTA phase 1 hasn't really been completed and the second phase hasn't been started. The CFTA negotiations, on the other hand, as they were launched, they are supposed to encompass both goods and services immediately. So I'm just wondering how the TFTA can serve as a launch pad for the CFTA. What is the relationship between the two? How are the three members of the tripartite dealing with or participating in or pushing forward or not the CFTA? That's my one question, which seems to me that this interaction between the two has to be clarified in some way, because ultimately the tripartite should be folded into the CFTA logically. Yet I didn't hear any reference to that. And the second is, like my colleague's question, what is the institutional support structure for the TFTA? Are the three RECs going to serve as the coordinating and implementing body jointly? Is there going to be a new institutional structure created? We know in the CFTA process, since it was launched at the heads of state of the African Union, it's the African Union Commission that has been named as both the coordinating body for the negotiations and the implementing body for the ultimate agreement. So what is the relationship between the AU, logically Department of Trade and Industry, and what is happening at the TFTA level? So I guess all of these things, in my mind, need to be a little bit clarified. If our speakers could maybe address those, if they know, and surely they will know about them because they're participating, that would be really helpful. Thank you so much.
Well, Sherry, as far as your first question is concerned, I think that's really the subject of the second half of this meeting. So we don't really want to preempt Darlington's session entirely in that respect. Sorry, over there and then here.
Thank you very much for calling for this event. First of all, actually, I have a question. Why all the FTAs in Africa are starting with goods? Why they are not starting with services? Services is more important than goods in all FTAs, and services can lead to good FTA in goods. Secondly, African countries rely deeply and heavily on customs revenue. Do you have any mechanism for overcoming or addressing that problem? Because the revenue will go for the development in the African countries. The third question is related to the NTBs. As long as we want to increase our intra-trade in the region, we have to address issues related to NTBs. So is the Continental Free Trade Area or the Tripartite Free Trade Area addressing issues related to NTBs? Thank you.
Thank you. One more question here and one more there, and then we'll ask our panel to respond.
Thank you. My name is Madeleine Sheb. I'm from Cameroon and I live in Geneva. I would like to, I'm also the president of Health and Environment Program and the Voice of Africa in Geneva in Tribune de Genève. I just want to know this initiative taken by some countries in Africa, is it enlarged to Central African countries or only is Eastern African countries? And I would like to know if African Union do agree this initiative to do this negotiation by themselves, or they need also the help of European Union. I want to know if they are free to decide or they have some cooperation with European Union. Thank you.
One last question. Okay, and then David, and then, sorry, yes?
I just wanted to ask a question about the market integration pillar. It's obviously only one of the three pillars for the agreement, but I think it can be quite an important one because often the market access gives you a signal of whether governments are prepared to make hard reforms on sensitive products or whether aspects of the agreement relate more to political integration rather than really making meaningful changes. So I think it's quite an important issue. Zodwa mentioned in her presentation that the modalities at entry into force, which are 60 to 85%, are not necessarily particularly ambitious. It might just be a matter of what you're doing at the MFN level, but there was no reference to what the modalities would look like at the end of the implementation. So I'm just curious to know when the tariff schedules are negotiated over the next 12 months and they're finalised, what will the level of liberalisation actually look like in those agreements? And I know one of the earlier questions made a reference to the EPAs, for example, and saying that was a level of liberalisation that could be aimed for. I'm wondering if the African RECs amongst themselves could actually aim for a deeper level of liberalisation than what they've achieved with the European Union. And I'm also curious to know what the implementation period might look like, and after how many years of implementation some of the products which have traditionally been considered sensitive might actually start to be liberalised, if there is liberalisation of those sensitive products.
Okay, thanks. David, you had a quick question?
Not so much a question, but some quick comments. Firstly, I think one should mention that it's in the nature of trade negotiations that the process tends to have its bumps and starts along the road, and this whole question of incomplete house is very normal in a trade agreement. We don't have time to get into this, but if you look at the way NAFTA evolved from the Canada-US Free Trade Area Agreement, or if you look at the Uruguay round, how it progressed, and if you look at ASEAN, the ASEAN FTA, how it has emerged, you'll find that at different stages there were different levels of incompletion. So I think this is very normal in the way that trade negotiations lead to trade agreements. Then very quickly, I also wanted to comment on the very important points that Oswald made about innovation. And here just simply to say that the next area, which was also mentioned by Patrick, that we're working on, that's the Assessing Regional Integration in Africa flagship report. Will be focusing on innovation and competitiveness. Third quick comment has to do with, I think, a misunderstanding relating to, I think Oswald mentioned the TFTA boards. I'm sure Zodwa may come back to this, but there are no boards. You have the summit, you have the Council of Ministers, you have senior officials. But I'll leave that to Zodwa, but I do want to let that point pass. And then very quickly, just to pick up points that Magdi made. Firstly, the EPAs have only focused on tariffs. They have not gone into services or IPs. It's true that the expectation is that the EPAs will evolve and will eventually look at services and IPs. But really, my view is that the EPAs cannot provide a model for the CFTA, and we could elaborate on this later. It's also true that the EPAs have brought trade policy coherence, and that process is ongoing. But I would not see the EPAs as a model for the CFTA. Also, just to underscore a point that Magdi also made, and that is there is, in fact, a continental progression underpinned by a treaty, the Abuja Treaty, that requires a CFTA by 2017, a customs union by 2022, and an African Economic Community by 2028. And in a sense, there is now a rush to, after so many missed deadlines, there's now a rush to try to meet this agenda. We could also come back to this. Last point has to do with corruption. Actually, there's a lot of work that is now going on, especially on illicit financial flows. A lot of it is focused on mining, but it is not out of the conversation. And again, there's in time to get into this. But I thought I would just highlight these points that were raised.
That's very helpful. So now we know it's not just the house, it's the street, it's the whole city we're on the way to. This is all very good. I'll ask our panelists now just for a minute each to try to respond to some of these.
Thanks, Deborah. I will start reverse from the most recent. The gentleman at the back wanted to know more about the level of liberalization of the TFTA. The ultimate objective is to open up 100%. And whatever will be designated sensitive has a time frame of 5 to 8 years to fully open up. So the ultimate objective is to have an FTA without any sensitivities. And then when it comes to I think I'll go to the question raised by our colleague from Sudan. Why are the FTAs in Africa starting with goods? I'm not sure, and I would allow my other colleagues to respond to that. The issue of NTPs, we have a whole annex, I think it's Annex 3, that deals with non-tariff barriers. And we have a mechanism that reports and notifies on NTPs in the 3 regs. It's open to everyone. It's sort of a name and shame. So it's already working, where any private sector person or any member state that faces an NTP can log onto the system, report on that, and then you have a manager that monitors that in terms of how many of those NTPs have been resolved. So that is working, and it has sort of helped a lot, because we are seeing a number of NTPs being resolved that are notified in that system. So when it comes to NTPs, because we realize that you may do away with the tariffs, but then have the problem of NTPs. So the agreement has that. And then on I think it's Shelley who wanted to know the relationship between the TFTA and CFTA. David, our colleague here, will be making that presentation. But I must say that at the REC level, we are participating. We are part of the task force for the CFTA. The 8 regs that are recognized by the AUC, we've had several meetings. And what it means is that even the negotiating principles that the CFTA will adopt are the principles that the TFTA used. So the two are sort of aligned. But the challenge of having parallel negotiations, it is a challenge that we foresee in terms of resources and financial implications. So that's an issue that we need to address. The institutional structure support for the implementation of the TFTA, we must recognize that the regs, other than market or trade issues, they are dealing with a plethora of other issues. But in terms of trade, we believe that there will be agreement that there is a secretariat of the TFTA that will deal with those issues. Currently, how we coordinate the negotiations is rotational. The Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa has been coordinating. On the 6th of June, we are handing over to SADC, the EAC. But I mean, that's not sustainable. At some point, you need, even if you call it unit, I don't care what you call it, but there has to be dedicated staff that will deal with the implementation of the TFTA. Otherwise, it might just be one of those initiatives that were driven perhaps by donors, and then regs focus on what they've been doing. So there's that belief, and we have, as the Secretariat, we've put in a proposal to the bodies of negotiations to say, having assessed the situation on the ground from 2011, there is need to have a unit that will coordinate. When it comes to the boards, which my colleague also raised, the tripartite has 5 levels, institutional, that's the institutional level. At the highest, you have the Summit of Heads of State and Government, and then followed by the Council of Ministers. Then we have ministerial meetings that are responsible for trade, infrastructure, and industrial development. And then you have senior officials, which are more like the PSs. And then at the basic level, you have the Tripartite Trade Negotiating Forum. But then again, there's a dotted layer beneath of technical working groups, because then they realize that some issues may need to be threshed out at a technical level before they come for negotiation. So those technical working groups, they feed into in the Tripartite Trade Negotiating Forum. So in terms of how the institutional arrangement is, it's the same. You have not come up with any new structure or anything. And I think here the AUC is the unifying factor. So all of us, all of the member states, they belong to the AUC. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think most of the questions have been tackled by Zodwa because really they were about the reg issues, not for the bank. And I think I would say I'm positively optimistic about the unfinished house issue. That said, though, we have so many houses like that on the continent of Africa. We have 8 regs that are recognized by the AUC, and besides those, we have a plethora of other regional integration organizations. Some of them exist in name only. If you go there, you might find 1 or 2 people sitting in a corner. So, but this process, we hope, is going to be different with all this political impetus that it is coming with. So may it continue to go on that path, so we may have a complete house one day. Thank you.
Thank you, Tipora. I'm just going to attend to maybe 2 or 3. I think the first one, obviously, is to say to David, you're right. What I referred to is actually the architecture of the CFTA, which obviously has got the AU summit at the top and all the other boards that follow. With obviously at the bottom there your African Trade Forum and others in that regard. But certainly you are more competent to be able to speak in that regard, and I hope to be able to get more information in your next presentation. The issue of private sector participation, I agree with you. For me as a private sector face in the region, SADC, I'm more frustrated than anybody else. But certainly there is a lot of progress that is happening. We are always not at the table, but on the table in most cases. But with this conversation, especially led from the AUC and African Union, I think it's providing a template for proper PPD at member state level. The movement is really to make sure that economic players like us, are able to input. There are quite a number of forums that we are contributing to that enhances our contribution to all the positions that are taken. I also wanted to address the issue of movement of business persons. This is an area, I think, that continues to be thrown around different aspects of the discussions, whether ministries of trade are competent enough to be able to look at movement of people, or it's another organ of the AU that does that. And I was pleasantly surprised in the last preparatory meetings of the launch of the CFTA, where then a discussion on negotiations emanated. And allow me to just even throw in the issues of products and services that came from the floor. There was so much discussion from experts and secretariats around the use of the term parallel. The term parallel meaning, are we going to be negotiating both products and services at the same time? Or we are going to do, and you can see that member states who are strong in services would want to start with services. Those that are strong in products would want to start with products. But the fact that that discussion and conversation is going on, then obviously there is some progress in that regard. And I will lastly comment on and agree with His Excellency there to say that secretariats, for some reason, politicians and political will have been given. But you see that experts, senior officials, and they bog themselves down on unnecessary text in most cases. You find they spend so much time discussing text. You see, we miss, the boat, paralysis by analysis. So these are some of the issues that come in, but certainly we are moving somewhere. Unless there is something that I have not attended to, I think I'll end here, Madam Chair.
Well, right, we understand the frustrations very clearly. I think it's really been quite a fascinating insight into where we are with the building of the house and what the house should look like and how the house forms part of the city. And while we certainly recognize that there is some frustration out there, there is some frustration with the slow pace at the way things have been going and the way Zodwa has acknowledged the way time was wasted in the beginning on what you see to be extraneous issues and so on. And we do understand this. And we also understand that there's a level of uncertainty and pressure in looking at the items that still have to be completed and how we will complete those items in the next year and move forward into the second phase. There are also those practical challenges as to how that would go forward. We also understand very well that the private sector feels enthused at being part of the process in a way, but not necessarily included in another way, and a little bit sort of uncertain as to how exactly those benefits will be reaped. But nonetheless, I think we do sense that there is an enormous enthusiasm about this very important step on the path of Africa Rising, and that there seems to be a considerable momentum behind these discussions and these processes that we want to take advantage of and to keep going. So we're very much looking forward also to the second half of these discussions this afternoon that Darlington will lead, that will look at how we fit into the bigger picture of the continental arrangements. I'd like to invite you all now to have a cup of coffee or tea outside and then to join us back here in 15 minutes for the second round. Thank you.
The second session of this dialogue will relate to the Continental FTA, and I have two colleagues joining me in this session. Vinay Ancharas, on my left, is a senior development economist at ICTSD. And then David Luke on my right is coordinator for African Trade Policy Center, Regional Integration and Trade Division at UNECA from Addis. By way of introducing the discussion, in order to put our discussion in context, you will recall that African-wide development agenda is based primarily on regional integration and formation of an African economic community as an end organization. African integration roadmap considers RECs as building blocks to the African economic community. So what is happening right now in terms of formation of the TFTA is sort of the building block towards achieving the AEC. But of course, before that, you recall that in January 2012, the heads of state agreed on a roadmap to establish a CFTA by 2017. The roadmap, which of course my colleagues will speak to, builds on what is happening in the TFTA. The second block, of course, which is the West African block involving ECOWAS, ECCA, and CENSAD, and so forth, began their discussions in January of 2012. So that discussion is also happening as a building block to get into CFTA. Of course, the rationale is to build on the gains of intra-Africa trade. And already the presenters before have talked to the sort of size of population Africa has of about 1.4 billion people. And UNECA has calculated that achieving a CFTA would increase intra-Africa trade by as much as 35 billion per annum. So therefore, this is again that is prompting this agenda for Africa. So what we want to discuss now is what does this mean for Africa in terms of CFTA? How are the negotiations? What is the status? What will this mean to other trading partners? But of course, this agenda is not without challenges. Africa is trading in a global market. What are the other influences that are affecting the formation of African integration? Vinay is going to speak to the challenges of deepening African integration in the context of global challenges. And then we'll hear from David, who will talk about more on the CFTA, where we are and how we are getting to achieving the goals of the CFTA. I'll invite Vinay to open our discussion. Vinay.
Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll be talking about, I'll take a sort of a hardline economic approach to African integration, talk about where we really are, make a sort of a reality check on the level of integration that has been achieved so far, and how much further we can go, especially at a time of global challenges. There are so many forces, external, regional as well, multilateral, acting on the continent, acting on the regional integration agenda, and that sort of raises the question, really, how much further progress can we make? I very much like this analogy of an unfinished house. It's okay to move into a house. I mean, in my country, people also do that. unfinished house, so long as you have a roof. It could be that you don't have all the windows, but that's fine. But my concern is if the foundation itself is not strong, you're in trouble. And that is really what I'm going to talk about. We are talking about ambitious integration initiatives. We are talking about the TFTA. We're talking about the Grand Africa FTA. But what about the regs in this process? What about SADC? What about the EAC? What about COMESA? What about ECOWAS? You know, are these regs really getting lost in translation? I mean, that is going to be the focus of my intervention this afternoon. So that's the sort of the outline of the presentation, the road traveled so far. Where are we? What is the current state of integration? And what are the challenges and opportunities? So it all starts with the Abuja Treaty, which came up in 1991, but then ratified in 1994. And it envisages the establishment of a complete African economic community over 6 phases and over 34 years by the year 2028. Now, there was a question earlier by Mr. Farahat, who was sitting there, about Africa missing all the deadlines when it comes to regional integration. Actually, I beg to differ. We are on target, and you see it from here. I hope you can see that. It may look a bit small. This is the green ones are the 6 stages as envisaged in the Abuja Treaty. So just to give you an example, the third stage, which is meant to be completed by 2017, foresees the establishment of FTAs and customs union at the REC level. Okay, most of the RECs, and I'm going to come to that in a second, most of the RECs already had achieved an FTA before 2017. Actually, before 2017, and today, in 2015 already, the TFTA has been launched. So in a sense, it's ahead of schedule. The thinking now is the next milestone is the Continental FTA, and we are thinking of 2017 for the launch of the Continental FTA, when actually the Abuja Treaty provided for 2019. So in a sense, we are either on target or actually, in fact, also ahead of time. And the ultimate sort of target really is to get to an African economic and monetary union by 2028. This one gives you the more sort of detailed picture of. I won't have time to go over that, but the problem is while we are making progress at that sort of broader level, and this is what I started out saying, at the level of the RECs, we see that there have been delays, and this is really where the delays are. And the RECs themselves have, at least on paper, different levels of ambition. Some want to be a customs union, but some want to be a common market. Some want to go even further, become a political federation, which is the case, for example, with the EAC. But there has been delays at that level. And I'm going to take just the example of SADC to illustrate, okay? So the way to read this chart is the green one, the green rectangles are actually what's been achieved already. The orange one is what's in progress, and the blue ones are what is sort of planned ahead. So if you look at the green one, the COMESA has already achieved an FTA, EAC has already achieved a customs union, and the common market is in progress. In the case of SADC, all that has been achieved up till now is an FTA. It was envisaged that a customs union would be achieved by 2010. We missed the target. It was envisaged that a common market would be achieved by 2015, this year. We are falling far behind. And obviously, the monetary union, nowhere in sight. So that is the level at which really the delays have occurred. Now, the question is, when regional integration at the level of the RECs have been lagging behind, is it the time to be talking about those grand ambitions, really? So to answer that, let us have a quick look at really where we stand in terms of regional integration in Africa. So this chart gives you, it plots what we call trade intensities. Trade intensity is the percentage of trade of an FTA that happens within the FTA. So intra-EAC trade, intra-SADC trade, and so on and so forth. So we see here that the EAC, among the four, I have picked the four main ones. I think in Africa, these are the four main blocks. EAC obviously is ahead of the curve. I have given you also some numbers there, which are the average intensities for the past 5 years. EAC has achieved a 17% trade intensity, followed by SADC. ECOWAS and COMESA are far behind, with an intensity of about 6%. Now, those are really very low numbers. Even EAC, which is the best performer, with 17%, is actually well below, for example, the level of intra-regional trade in ASEAN. ASEAN has about 40%, okay? The EU, which you can think also of under the sort of regional bloc, much higher levels of integration. So again, that prompts the question, when we are really falling behind in terms of deepening integration at the REC level, should we be talking about moving ahead to more ambitious targets? Now, the good thing is, if you look at intra-Africa trade over the years, it has gone up. It has gone up consistently, okay? Whether you look at intra-Africa trade or intra-TFTA trade, which is what I'm focusing on. But again, if you look at, for example, intra-TFTA trade, which is the right-hand side chart, the blue line is total intra-TFTA, and the orange line, the orange curve, is TFTA minus South Africa. And I hope you can see what this means. If you just take South Africa away, you can see the sharp drop in the level of intra-TFTA exports, which says that it is really South Africa that is driving trade in this bigger region, okay? And the question then is, what about the other economies? If you subtract Angola and Egypt, which are another two big traders in the region, the curve again goes down. So at the end of the day, you're looking at the line, the lowest curve, which is the yellow one, and which comes to about, an intra-TFTA export level of 8 billion, maybe 10 billion in 2013, compared to about 40 billion for the whole, okay? So it tells you really that there is a high degree of what economists call polarization, meaning that regional integration is really being driven by just a few economies. The rest are not really participating. And here you have a similar picture for Africa as a whole and for TFTA. So we are talking about the Africa trade intensity, which is the blue curve, and the TFTA trade intensity, which is the orange curve. The TFTA intensity obviously is higher than Africa, and that reflects the fact that the TFTA as a region corresponds to the ESA region, the Eastern and Southern Africa region, which, as I showed earlier, has one of the highest levels of integration in Africa. So it's driven mainly by the EAC. Now, while we talk about trade, let us not forget investment. I didn't hear any of my colleagues before really talking about investment, but investment is very much part of these treaties as much as trade is. What do we see in terms of investment? Well, the picture here is very positive, I would say, because starting from very low levels of investment, we have seen quite significant increases in both the volume of investment and the share of Africa in those investment flows. So just to give you a very quick sort of appreciation of this, you can see, for example, in COMESA, okay, FDI flows, total FDI flows in 2003-2005 was about 18 billion, and they went up to 34 billion, so that's a doubling of FDI. And of that, intra-regional flows, intra-regional meaning FDI by COMESA member states within the COMESA region, okay? In 2003-2005 was 0.2, really very, very small. It went up to 2.6, quite significant. And the share of the intra-regional FDI share went up from 1 to 8% during this period. And when you look across the RECs, you see the same picture emerging consistently. So EAC, the intra-regional share of FDI went up from 2% to 14%. In the SADC, from 4% to 10%. I think that's a very positive story, and we shouldn't be missing it. Now, but on the whole, when I was talking about the lack of progress at the level of the RECs, we have to understand those factors. My colleagues mentioned some of the challenges relating to the TFTA, but what are the challenges really at the level of the RECs? And some of the usual suspects arise here, but some not so usual also. The main question, at least to me, is whether the RECs, whether regional integration in Africa is driven by politics or economics. I think that's a crucial question. Okay? When you look at regional trade elsewhere or regional initiatives elsewhere, ASEAN, I think you can take as an example. ASEAN has been driven by economics, meaning the motivation really was to boost trade because trade was seen as a vehicle for growth and development. Whereas in Africa, I think we would agree on that, okay, the regional integration was largely motivated by Africa's colonial legacy. So the idea was, how do you really build a continent that has been left fragmented with large population, small populations, but large in size, large in physical size, but small populations, and then long distances between countries, landlocked countries, many of them. So how do you really deal with that? So that was the reason that really motivated regional integration. It was not really, people were not thinking about economics. It was more like the political sort of motivation that was the key motivation here. So low levels of commitment also because of non-compliance. And the problem here is non-compliance is not being sanctioned. You don't comply with your commitments, okay? First of all, there is really, in many countries, very low level of commitment in terms of, for example, tariff liberalization. But even the commitments that you have taken, you don't implement, and there is no sanction. The only case that I can remember is the case of, this is polytol, which is a paint, actually, being produced in COMESA in Egypt. And the case is an interesting one because this paint was being exported to Mauritius, which is another COMESA country. And Mauritius decided to just raise tariffs because it was competing with locally produced paint, and the government decided to just raise tariffs to basically keep Egyptian paint out. And that led to an outcry by Egypt. They took it to the tribunal, the COMESA tribunal, but luckily, before the tribunal even ruled, Mauritius decided to take the duties out and let trade flow. That's a special case. The point is, and let's face it, Egypt and Mauritius are two of the most developed countries in Africa, and therefore Egypt could take the case to the tribunal. Maybe some other country could have done it, so given the resources that it requires. So the problem is, just to say it again, commitments are not being followed through, and unfortunately, there are no penalties and sanctions for non-compliance. That is one thing that, that needs to be addressed. And then implementation costs and institutional, I mean, we talked about that. The problem is, and I have quoted it so that you don't take me out on it, it comes from the African Development Report, which says, treaties and protocols outline what should be done, but not how to do it. I think this is crucial, okay? We have a whole plethora of treaties and conventions and protocols in Africa across different regs. They talk about what you should do, but not how you should do it. And the same applies to, and I hope my friend David would throw some light on that, like this process of moving from the TFTA to the CFTA. Right now, when you look at it, it appears like that there's a huge gap, and we are in the dark as to how do you really get there, you know? So the message that's coming from the AUC is that, you know, the other regs will somehow align with the TFTA as they move towards the CFTA. How will that happen? Nobody, at least I don't know. So, and then another problem is the reluctance of African states to cede sovereignty to the regional level. No country wants to do that. Okay, someone was saying earlier that these agreements are done at the regional level but implemented at the national level, and that's where the problem is. At the national level, the question of sovereignty emerges, and you don't want to cede sovereignty to a regional body. And polarization of trade, I mentioned that. Okay, let me quickly come to the challenges and opportunities. We are in a global context, I would say, really, which is being characterized by fragility. Okay, fragile economic recovery, a Doha round that is not complete. At the same time, we have, maybe partly as a result of the fact that the Doha round hasn't been completed, the emergence of mega regionals, plurilaterals, you name it. And all these forces are bearing on regional integration. Some of them are positive, some of them are negative. The question is, how can regional integration make progress when it has to grapple with all these external influences? So I'm going to very briefly talk about some of these challenges and opportunities. The challenges that I think can be described as challenges are the EPAs, the EPS, EPs, the emerging partners, Africa's emerging partners, the mega regionals. I see those as key challenges, but also opportunities. AGOA, the trade facilitation agreement, regional value chains, but also let's not forget that depending on how you look at it, challenges can actually be turned into opportunities. It's a matter of looking at the glass as half empty or half full. How much time do I have? 1 minute? 1 minute? Yes. Oh, I'm now coming to it. Okay. Okay, so the EPAs have been concluded. The estimates of gains, as you know, are largely negative because the EPAs basically require African countries to liberalize. And whereas you're not getting much from the Europeans because they already have liberalized 100%. But when the EPAs started, let's remember, there were these 5 regs. And those 5 regs were supposed to negotiate EPAs. But then the process really got fragmented because if you look at, for example, the SADC, okay, some countries decided to opt out of SADC and then negotiate an EPA on their own. And that has happened all over Africa. So in a way, right at the outset, the EPA really, it was meant to strengthen regional integration in Africa. It ended up really fragmenting the regional integration. But now, I think the EPAs are starting to incentivize African regs to deepen integration. And it's happening as a sort of a byproduct. Why? Because Africans are now facing up to the fact that if they don't deepen integration, they might end up giving more favorable market access to the Europeans than to their fellow neighbors and to member countries within a bloc. So that is what's pushing, driving the momentum also. very quickly. So here you see, and the next slide is going to talk about the emerging partners. So this graph is very telling because you can see how Africa's exports have evolved over a very short period of time. I'm talking about 2000 and 2013. EU in 2000 actually made up about 50% of Africa's exports. That has gone down to 36%. And look at the share of the BRIC, and that's BRIC without S, so it doesn't have South Africa there. So it was 8% in 2000, and in 2013, it has gone up to 28%. So significant rise of the of emerging partners, but the fact remains that the EU still is Africa's dominant trade partner, and that is why the EPAs, whatever you can say about them, is very important for the continent. I can skip this, I think. The mega regionals, TTIP, TPP, RCEP, and all those, the question that's emerging is how will these affect African trade? How will these affect integration in Africa? It all really boils down to what will happen, how will these mega regionals deal with the issue of standards, okay? And the question is, will there be harmonization of standards, and will there be some sort of mutual recognition that would be extended to third parties? If that is the case, then third parties can actually benefit, okay? So if you look at this table here, I have borrowed it from Frankos and Associates from at the World Trade Institute. They have estimated the impacts of the mega regionals, and they have these two scenarios, less ambitious and more ambitious. More ambitious meaning they allow for the fact that there will be some sort of spillover from mutual recognition, so the effect would be more positive. But in either case, even if you take the less ambitious case and you were to focus on, well, unfortunately, we don't have Africa as a separate group, but if you look at the LICs, which is comprise most of the African countries, you see that the effect is not negative. It's positive, but small, but it's not negative. So I would say that the mega regionals actually won't affect African trade and African integration to a large extent. Actually, they can have the opposite effect. They can actually push, because when other countries are integrating and you see big giants merging together, how do you react? And that's my next slide. What do? Do you turn protectionist? Do you liberalize? Do you create rival RTAs? I think this has been the response historically. With NAFTA, for example, when it emerged, you could see this sort of the theory of domino regionalism, meaning that one leads to another. So when others, it creates what in Baldwin's terms is called pressures for inclusion. So you have, you see a big regional FTA emerging, and you are excluded, so you tend to form an FTA of your own so that you can somehow don't feel like left out. AGOA. AGOA, the story, as you know, is that AGOA was renewed this year for another 10 years. The point about AGOA is that it really hasn't made much impact except for a couple of products. And apparel would be one of them, okay? If you look at it, AGOA really is spurred a sort of a regional value chain in apparel in southern Africa. So countries like Lesotho, Swaziland, Mauritius, Madagascar, but also Kenya to some extent. And that's the positive side of it. But beyond that, really little effect. Now, the question is, why? If you look at it, AGOA provides duty-free treatment on 1,835 products. And when we are talking about apparel, it's just one. So what about the rest? What's happening there? Now, the one sort of element of answer to this question is that, well, there are NTBs the NTBs are so significant that you can't export to the U.S. And also, some key products have not been included in AGOA. For example, sugar, peanuts, tobacco, the products that some African countries produce face prohibitive tariffs, and then also restrictions on the sugar and dairy content that prevent processing. In the case of cocoa, that's very significant. The question remains: can the AGOA be leveraged so that African countries reverse the trend with respect to U.S.? In an earlier graph, you could see that if you look at this red curve, which shows exports to the U.S., you could see a dip in Africa's exports to the U.S., and that is started in 2008. It recovered a bit, but then it's been going down again. The TFA can be an opportunity, especially given that some countries already are implementing TF measures, and they're doing it independently of the TFA. There is a bit of resistance to actually implement the agreement. No country, as far as I know, in Africa has yet ratified the agreement. So there is a bit of resistance, but my view is that when you look at it, the cost of implementing the TFA, especially if you sequence the measures properly, is really very small, and therefore African countries, I would say, should be implementing the TFA as a sort of a self-interested measure. Regional value chains, I'll just skip the slide just to make the point that, since I'm running out of time, just to make the point that there are tremendous opportunities there. As I mentioned earlier, we have a significant regional value chain in apparel. There are also other goods, especially agro processing, building materials in some cases, equipment, textiles, where opportunity for developing regional value chains actually exists. And when we talk about regional value chains, it's actually a sort of a bilateral causation, okay? Just like regional value chains could lead to the deepening of intra-Africa trade, similarly, intra-Africa trade can lead to the further development of regional value chains. So it's a two-way process. So just to conclude, so integration efforts have lagged. That's how I see it. There are significant opportunities, but it's a matter of really taking those opportunities and also capitalizing on them, but also trying to see how the challenges that are out there could be converted into opportunities. They could be seen from a more positive light. But some questions remain, and I would just throw these questions, and I hope that this would be, I didn't see these questions taken up earlier. One is, can the TFTA be yet another opportunity to boost integration, and if so, how? Now, you might say, well, that's a very simple question to ask, but let's face it, with the TFTA, the way I see it is that we are widening integration, but we are not deepening it. So the question is really, can we deepen integration with the TFTA? Is it yet another piece in the spaghetti bowl? We have so many RECs. Are we creating yet another institution? There was a question about another secretariat emerging and some people being averse to it. I don't want to go there, but my problem is more, are we creating yet another institution that at the end of the day won't make much of an impact? And what about this question? It is an FTA, so it has to abide by, it has to comply with GATT Article 24, liberalize substantially all trade. Are we doing it? Or are we just putting EAC, COMESA, and SADC together at existing levels of liberalization? Taking that as a benchmark, are we liberalizing further? That's my question. So the TFTA is just the beginning. Let's bear that in mind. It's not complete, as Zodwa said. We have annexes that are missing. There's a second phase that's coming, and bigger than that, we have the CFTA, which is further out there, and a huge gap between the TFTA, as far as I see it, and the CFTA with processes that are not clear, which I hope David would help enlighten. Thank you.
Thank you, Vinay. Of course, you raised very interesting questions, which I'm sure David is going to cover. Are we putting the cart before the horse? If the building blocks at the level of the regs have not deepened integration, why are we moving to talk about Continental FTA? Could you try and address those questions, David?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Darlington. I think I'm going to divert a bit from my presentation and actually outline areas where I agree with what Vinay has said and areas where I disagree, and also call into question some of the data that Vinay has presented to us, which is not quite consistent with data that we are familiar with at the Africa Trade Policy Center. Firstly, I think we all agree that this is an unfinished house, that at the REC level, integration has not gone as deep as was expected. But where I think I disagree is that it is now the time to correct it. And it's the time to correct it because the economic dynamics on the African continent are changing. And everybody recognizes this. And the effort that is now being made is to fill in the gaps and to correct what needs to be corrected. So this is where I would want to argue that the TFTA and indeed the CFTA, Darlington is not putting the cart before the horse, but actually is now to try to get the proper arrangement so that the horse can draw the cart. Secondly, this question of trade intensity. And here, one of the issues that we've always tried to deal with when we're looking at the data is not to double count or to extrapolate EAC out of COMESA. And what you have done by giving us a very low figure for COMESA on trade intensity, which does not quite jive with what we know, we are not quite sure what data you have included for EAC, and keep in mind that all the EAC members are also in COMESA. So we have always tried to be very careful how we look at data on EAC and COMESA. Another area I think I disagree is Europe certainly remains an important trading partner, but our own data shows that Europe is now neck and neck with China. And actually one of the issues we're trying to grapple with at the Africa Trade Policy Center is that we need to do some work to understand what is going on in the trade with China. And here I'll come to the question of economics and politics also. And here let me also say that as regards AGOA, the tech operator has been disappointing, and I think it's next week we'll be in Washington to discuss these issues in an AGOA midterm review. But what we are beginning to understand is that the US has traditionally not been an export destination for Africa historically. But then we are trying also to understand why is it that the BRICS, that your figures to some extent show this, and China, how is it that exports to China have increased in a way during the same period that AGOA has been in place, but not to the same level? I know that there are issues relating to the composition in both trade with China. Oil exports counts for a huge chunk. We all know this. But interestingly, we also have data showing that industrial products are being exported to China from Africa. And in fact, that's one of the fears are behind the RCEP and the modeling that we have done, which have shown that this gain in these sorts of exports likely to diminish. So again, I think some difference there. And I think one of the obvious issues to consider as regards Africa's trade with the U.S. is that the U.S. really has not put the effort into penetrating Africa the way that the BRICS, especially China, has done. So we see in the same period, the 2000s, because AGOA came into effect in 2000, up to this point, we've seen trade with China, exports to China increase, but we've seen exports to the U.S. being flat. And so we want to understand and to see and work with our American partners to see how they can increase their penetration and support export readiness. The question that regional integration is being driven by politics and not economics, here I think I disagree. I think if you go back and look at the seminal documents, including the Lagos Plan of Action, this is primarily an economic treatise. In fact, when we were working on the current area, the Assessing Regional Integration for Africa report, we found that one of the best sources, most original sources, on looking at scientific innovation, the institutional issues, policy issues, capacity issues, was actually the Lagos Plan of Action. So I think there's been a lot of thinking in post-independence Africa on these economic issues. And it's not, I think it's somewhat glib to say it's been driven only by politics. And I think the intensification that you see now is also a response, as I said earlier, to the changing dynamics on the continent. Literally, the way the continent is changing and what is behind the growth rates that we now see on the continent. So I think I would take issue with that. But having said that, implementation challenges, major issues, Vinay's quotation about the treaties and the protocols is true. Right now we are struggling with how to monitor, put in place an effective M&E monitor and evaluation system for the Boosting Intra-Africa Trade Initiative, which was adopted without proper indicators, and so we're working on all these areas. I fully agree with you. The question of sovereignty, but this is not unique to Africa. We see this being played out literally on our TV screens as regards the current Greece crisis. Also, the question of having, if you like, intra-African trade being dominated by a number of countries. Again, this is something we're grappling with, but it is not unusual to see this pattern in other regions. Within NAFTA, it's the US. Within ASEAN, it's Singapore and Malaysia, as distinct from how far behind LDCs like Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar are. And in fact, let's keep in mind that Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar only joined NAFTA, ASEAN relatively recently, and so on. So these imbalances are not unknown. And I think they're magnified in the African context because you have 33 LDCs, which is why, as Zorua and others have pointed out, that these FTAs are not being seen simply as a market access, market opening instrument, but actually a developmental instrument. And a lot of thinking is going into how to make this this development aspect effective. And by the way, no one apparently has come up with good answers to this. Here in the WTO, you have the Enhanced Integrated Framework, the EIF, which is limited in many ways, as we all know, and that's another conversation. So how to deal with these developmental issues is something that is grappling all of us, but which is not being ignored. And I am amazed at the progress that is being made in terms of infrastructure, the road network between Cairo and the Cape. I believe that 2/3 is completed, oil pipelines that are being put in place, and all of this, I have to say, is within, it's been somewhat chaotic because there are several other dynamics being played out on the continent. So I think it would be good to just put some of these issues in context, that this half-finished house is not unusual. We see this in other trade agreements, the process leading to other trade agreements. But there is a dynamic which African policymakers have understood and which they're trying to respond to. The response may not be perfect, but it's much better than not doing anything about it. And I think this is what we all trying to say. So I thought I would just make these few comments to begin with, and I'm sure that this part of the discussion, a conversation, may be much more interesting than my presentation. And I'll go through the presentation very quickly and really highlight the key issue, which is how to get to the CFTA. I have here a listing of the various principles that have been adopted by the AU Summit. I'm not going to get into them, only to flag that when you're dealing with big economies like South Africa and Egypt, as well as LDCs, this whole question of flexibility, special and differential treatment, and also trying to take decisions by consensus, these are all, if you like, contradictory principles which would need to be worked out in practice. And I will show later that one of the ways that we are seeing this being worked out in practice is that countries really are being cautious in how they're liberalizing, not being sure of, firstly the tariff revenue loss issue, but they're not being sure of exactly how their growth trajectory will unfold. So that is one of the, I think one of the dilemmas that you find among countries. Somebody asked earlier, why not start with services? And actually, there's been a huge debate on this, which is why there's agreement to move into the CFTA on both goods and services, and to do this simultaneously. Now, it's huge, it's an ambitious goal, but again, I would argue that it's, there are ways in which it could be done. And, I'll come to this. It's very clear that the CFTA would, in fact, build on the TFTA. The goal is 100% liberalization. We may not get there in year one, given the developmental mode and substantially all liberalization, GATT Article 24, as Vinay rightly pointed out, we may not get there in year one, but that is the goal. But we don't need to get there in year one either. That is the goal. You've heard from Zorwa that the liberalization under the TFTA was not ambitious, although, again, there's an expectation that over time the changes would be made. And within the CFTA, we're looking to see how exactly the tariff schedule that will accompany the agreement, what exactly it will look like. One of the areas where I think there's been a lot of progress is in dealing with NTBs. And here, again, I would disagree with Vinay that there are no sanctions for compliance. And you gave one example, Mauritius, Egypt, but I can tell you that on a daily basis, the NTB complaints, you need to, where the websites are up and running, you can look and see. But aside from that, the NTB type complaints that are being resolved in a non-adversarial way, it has to be said. And here, parenthetically, I might just note that I've heard several trade policy makers and trade negotiators in African context talk about we are negotiating and we're applying these agreements in a family context, not in the WTO. So the adversarial aspect and sanctions and so on takes on a different hue. That point has been made. But NTBs are being dealt with, and I would expect that the TFTA, which has a good record on the notification of NTBs and trying to resolve them and so on, that it could be that for the CFTA, the NTBs process could build upon this. The trade remedies dispute settlement arrangements in the TFTA are not yet finalized, but again, we would expect that as this issue is dealt with, we'll look to see how it could be addressed in the CFTA context. So again, in terms of the big picture, what I'm saying here is that we do have all these different bits, these different aspects of this unfinished house, but the CFTA is the opportunity to see how to resolve and to complete this, this house. Here, the issue about rules of origin and various other issues that the TFTA has dealt with. The rules of origin, only 25% of the work has been done, and there is scope to build on this. Now, in terms of how to get there, again, I cannot give you a blueprint here, but there are some ideas that are out there that are being discussed. There is no blueprint. And in fact, the work relating to the modalities, I'll come back to this, has not yet even begun. We expect that to begin within weeks. But one logical proposal that has come from the Secretary General of COMESA is to have ECOWAS and the tripartite bloc negotiate to form the core of the CFTA. Of course, this includes dealing with a lot of technical issues as regards the tariff liberalization, as regards rules of origin, especially. And we know that this work is unfinished business in the TFTA. But we see this as a logical way forward. ECOWAS does have a common external tariff, and also within ECOWAS, there are issues in regard to how the ECOWAS FTA is actually administered. But nonetheless, we see this as the logical starting point. That leaves North Africa, which is covered by the Arab Maghreb Union, and Central Africa, and there was a question about Central Africa, which is covered by ECAS. For all practical purposes, we're not so much focusing on the other RECs that are recognized by the AUC, namely CENSAD and IGAD. But we see a possibility of bringing UMA and ECAS into this conversation, recognizing that how they join the CFTA is something that would have to be negotiated, but we don't see the starting point only being exclusive to ECOWAS and the tripartite and leaving North and Central Africa out. We feel that they would come in and would need to see exactly what the right modalities would be for the engagement of UMA and ECAS. The clearly issues that would have to do with the timelines for the implementation of the tariff schedules that agreed and so on, and there would be need to ensure that the timelines in the CFTA and the TFTA are consistent. We see an issue here, which is why I've highlighted it. Most of these I have already touched on. The issue of the tariff liberalization, also Zodwa touched on this, given the differences and discrepancies between the RECs. But as I said earlier, the CFTA is the opportunity to try to bring coherence to the picture that we now have. The question of transition periods also would need to be properly aligned, but taking into account that you do have, as I say, these 33 LDCs, and we need to see how exactly special and differential treatment would be applied as regards these LDCs and as regards the pace of tariff liberalization among the LDCs. Issues of rules of origin I've touched on, how to interpret the acquis, the overall agreements of in the RECs, the TFTA and so on, where there have been fundamental differences of interpretation. Those two need to be looked at. Yes, resources for negotiations need to be looked at as well. But the point I would make is that there is very strong political will to bring this about. That is becoming very clear. And indeed, the structure within the African Union, which includes a high-level trade policy committee that is part of the summit, a subcommittee of the summit itself, which will require regular reporting, means that there is a forum for political engagement and for driving the process. Also, Africa is working on this ambitious Agenda 2063 project, which is aimed at driving convergence among African countries and more developed countries and regions with action in a variety of policy areas. The CFTA is one of the flagship projects of Agenda 2063. And this means that, as I say, there is much that political backing behind doing the CFTA in response to the unfolding economic dynamics in the region. I will skip these questions. I'll come to possible milestones for the CFTA. And here again, there is no blueprint. This is just some thinking that is out there. 2017 is the firm date, which is, as you have heard, is the Abuja Treaty does require and that's a treaty commitment, requires the CFTA by 2017. This date can only be changed by the summit. So what we see going forward is the next year or so to look at preparatory issues, modalities for how to do the negotiations. 2016 to the end of 2017 to engage in negotiations to look to see on the tariffs what is now by then, by 2016, would be available from the TFTA and how we could bring that into the picture. Then the 2018, the January 2018 AU Summit, the AU meets twice in January and in July. June or July, it met in June this year, the adoption of the agreement, and then 2018 we see some legal scrubbing. Now, all this is very ambitious, but we feel it can be done. I will not go into, the comparisons we are making here. We can come back to this if you like. But what I have here, again, there is no blueprint. The discussions are still ongoing. But I have these few points that are based on a paper that you can find on the Africa Trade Policy Center website. And it is a non-paper, and I think the title is The Case for a Framework, a CFTA Framework Agreement, as probably one way in which this ambitious timeline of 2017 could be met. And basically, what the suggestion is that we can have an interim pact that will identify the areas in principle that will be covered by the CFTA, and to provide some more detail, much more than we now have in terms of what the summit has agreed as the scope of the negotiations and so on. And here we can learn from ASEAN, because ASEAN has moved with this kind of modality of a framework agreement as an interim pact. We see possibility of an early harvest in trade in goods, despite the technical issues that have to be worked on as regards tariff schedules and rules of origin. We see services being prioritized, those services that facilitate investment or reduce trade costs. Here I agree with Vinay that trade facilitation is very important for Africa, although I would also argue that Africa does not need a WTO trade facilitation agreement, trade facilitation is important. There's need to work on trade facilitation, but whether you need a multilateral agreement is another question. And that's clearly, we have been advocating at the Africa Trade Policy Center on the importance of reducing trade costs, dealing with trade facilitation. Certainly, we see the services being prioritized that reduce trade costs. And one way in dealing with this would be perhaps to have an investment agreement that facilitates, that speaks to services in different sectors, and that will be covered by the investment agreement, which means that you don't need a separate services agreement. Again, there is something that we could borrow from ASEAN here, where they have a comprehensive investment agreement that covers the services sectors. So that might be one way in which we can deal with services in the CFTA. As I said, this is not a blueprint, but these are ideas that are out there. We're not building on nothing. There are regional rules in regard to already even on investment, competition policy, intellectual property, so we could look to see what to take out of these regional rules and how to continentalize them, if I could put it this way. We all recognize that rules of origin are important for any free trade area to work, so we'll need to work on this as well during that 1-year window. And then, of course, deal in practice with the S&DT issues, variable geometry, etc. Again, we can borrow from ASEAN because Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar have different liberalization schedules and timeframes within ASEAN, and a number of other special provisions for those 3 LDCs that function within ASEAN. So there's something that we can borrow from that as well. And then, of course, the trade remedies and dispute settlement. So, again, as I said, this is not a blueprint, but we feel that these are areas in which we can work. I'll just close. Now, the pessimists say that the lapses at REC level, and my friend Vinay, I'm not painting you with a pessimist paint, but all the same. But, obviously, I'm doing the work I'm doing, and I'm employed by whom I'm employed because I'm an optimist and on this, and it's part of my job to help to make it happen. Again, there is some skepticism as regards implementation at country level, but we don't think that this skepticism is warranted because each of the countries involved have functioning trade ministries. Capacity issues are a challenge here and there, but tariffs are being administered on a day-to-day basis as we speak because trade happens. So we're again not building from scratch. There's a lot there that is already there that we're building on. I'll just end by saying that we feel that the CFTA can be done. It may require a framework agreement that is not detailed, but would be an agreement with commercial value, especially if it speaks to goods, rules of origin, tariff liberalization, investment, and through investments, some priority service areas, and then with the building agenda to deal with other issues that would need to be looked at. So my parting shot is the CFTA can be done. And when I go back to Addis, I'll roll up my sleeves and see what I can do to help make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for that very positive ending note. One of the issues that obviously we have been looking at and questioning ourselves is that if the regs are going to be the building blocks and TFTA is the building block towards a continental FTA, what happens to the regs? No one has addressed the fact, will COMESA continue to exist? Will SADC continue to exist? Or these are being phased out? And now we should just be dealing with the TFTA. And I think that we should come back to Zodwa or David to try and address that issue. No one has addressed that issue. I would open the floor at this stage, considering that we are a little behind schedule. I would ask you to be brief in your contributions or questions. First question or contribution from Mr. Chisanga.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My name is Chisanga. I'm from UNCTAD. and I'll be very quick. I want to thank the presenters for their presentation. I just have one issue to discuss, or for us to go back to our workplaces and think about. And this has been elaborated upon by Vinay, the first speaker. I want to belong to his school of thought as an African. I want to belong to the school of thought of Vinay. I think it's more productive for us, the Africans as well as others, non-Africans supporting regional integration for Africa, that we don't take an optimistic approach. Otherwise, we will not see the problems. I can understand Luke's problem of protecting or promoting the product, that you have. I can understand that. But I think there is also the problem of what I could call the elite capture and glamorous promotion of regional integration by the elite. By the elite means the few of us who understand the issues, the few of us who are educated, the few of us who are inside inside the playground, inside the regional integration, secretariat like Luke himself, that we tend to use elitism to defend and protect. But in the end, I mean, everyone knows that the regional integration for Africa started many years ago. And so far, the only images that we have seen are more pronouncements of formations of new structures. There is really no concrete thing that one can look at. I mean, for instance, the intra-trade as a percentage of total, which we export to the world, is very low, has been moving at 12%. It only increased to 14% this year or last year. But if you look at the individual country intra-Africa regional exports as a percentage of what they export to the outside world, the figures are very, very small. What does that mean? That means that as long as the figures are less than 30% or 20%, it means the countries continue to focus on exports, on exporting to the external world. There are more speeches about increasing intra-Africa trade than there is action. So, and I think it's important for us not to ignore the small BRICS, meaning the small countries whose participation in regional integration is very, very minimal. Vinay made this point. It's a very important point. As long as we continue to ignore the small BRICS, a magnificent building is unlikely to emerge. I'm talking about countries like Rwanda, Burundi. What do they have to gain from the figures which you are saying combined GDP of 1.3 trillion or billion? What is the percentage of Burundi in that GDP? A big market, combined trade of 20 trillion or whatever. What is the percentage of Burundi? This is also the reason why small countries are reluctant. This is why they don't want to sell their sovereignty. If the picture was bright, that asymmetries would be addressed, I think there would be, most of them would be on board. But you cannot just say flexibilities will be addressed and so on. These things we have heard about, if there are not concrete measures, you will find that the small countries will continue not to be part of the integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tsanga. Any other question or contribution? Yes.
Thank you. I'm Jos Pauwele, and I'm a professor here at the Graduate Institute in Geneva and at Georgetown University. So as a law professor, I was really intrigued at what may materialize in a couple of years. If you think of the trade relations between South Africa and Namibia, I can picture 5 different levels of treaties that would apply between these countries. You have the WTO, you have the CFTA, the TFTA, the SADC, and the SACU. I'm not saying this is by definition bad, but I'm very interested in how the negotiators would see the priorities between these layers. Because I can see arguments to say what rules come out of this building should prevail. It's kind of the multilateral system. But I can equally see reasons to say, well, what they've agreed in SACU is the more specific deal, more adapted to those two countries. So perhaps that should prevail. And it took me a while to find the legal text of the TFTA, but apparently the decision was that the TFTA would prevail over everything below it, would prevail over COMESA, EAC, SADC, which makes me wonder, I mean, what that means if somehow the TFTA is backsliding, allowing for more trade restrictions, that would undo liberalization you've agreed to lower down. Equally, if you have between two SACU countries kind of a specific deal that you want to keep in place, that could be undone by the TFTA. So I'm kind of intrigued how the panelists see the relation, the priority between these potentially 5 layers. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Yes.
Okay. My name is Mena Hassan, the WTO Secretariat. Thank you very much for a very interesting set of presentations. I have 2 questions. The first relates to sort of the aim or the main objective that was set out in the earlier today regarding the fact that eventually the TFTA would be a customs union, if I understand it, and also to try and address overlapping memberships. But as you know, that one of the main or fundamental characteristics of a customs union is the common external tariff. So you'd have one CET, which means that a country can only be a member of one customs union. And in this case, if we look at 10 members of the TFTA, 5 members in the EEC, and 5 members in SACU, they are each, we have 2 customs unions. So in a sense, has this been kind of discussed? How will these 10 members reconcile their memberships in these 2 customs unions? And then my second question is, how viable is this TFTA if, as I understand, until now, South Africa has not signed on? Thank you.
Thank you. If are there any more questions, maybe we can ask the panelists to address those questions that have been raised. Okay, I'll start with David. Do you want to take up any? Sure, please. Sure.
Yeah. Actually, one of the challenges is to engage the African public on the CFTA. And, you know, the way I've put it in discussions with the AUC and the Africa Trade Policy Center is how to take this conversation outside of Addis Ababa. Fortunately, we have some strong partners that are helping us do this. My good friend, Susan Matthews, I don't mean to put Susan on the spot, is from the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights. And together with Susan and her team and the Frederick Abbott Stiftung, we're actually doing a human rights impact assessment of the CFTA. This is an ex-ante assessment, and focusing on the likely impacts on employment, agricultural livelihoods, and food security. So just to assure Sangha that this is not just an elitist kind of approach. I don't think it's a fair appellation, and that there are many of us who are trying to work to understand how those that are most vulnerable could be impacted, and then having understood this, what could be done about it. So I'll just make that comment in regard to that. You know, the next point is true that small countries, although I will not put Uganda in that category, but certainly Burundi, Zambia has been especially vocal in, your own country, Sanga, as regards LDCs in the CFTA. And I think we're all learning and trying to understand what flexibilities would mean in practice, and how to reconcile that with this move towards a continental free trade area and a continental market. I don't think we all have the answers. I think we're all trying to learn and understand as we go along. But I don't see a reluctance among any of these countries to engage. And I see it as the way in which they're trying to address these issues of achieving convergence with respect to trade policy and trade institution building. And they're all grappling with it in different ways. And certainly it's a process. And I would say that we need to look over the next 10 to 12 years, really, to see how this process unfolds. I don't think we all have the answers today. As regards the question of what takes precedence, which is related also to the question of what would happen to the RECs that you raised, Darlington, at the beginning and so on. My own view, and again, as I said, there are no blueprints on this. The latter issue first, what would happen to the RECs, is that eventually, as trade liberalization takes root on the continent, I think the functions of the RECs will shift in some ways. I see a shift towards especially dealing with the infrastructure, connectivity, policy coherence across a whole range of sectors, including the productive sectors and so on. I think that you're likely to see that happen, given that obviously as you move towards a continent-wide CFTA and beyond that, you need the level of the African Union Commission to have the administrative apparatus that would support that. Again, this is, as I say, these are ideas that are out there. In regard to the 5 layers, the WTO as a multilateral agreement, in a sense, stands above and out there because there are commitments that have been made there, and I don't know of any African country which is questioning those commitments. I think it's best to see the TFTA as a transitional arrangement that will fold into the CFTA. I think logically that is what would happen over time. The question of the 2 countries, South Africa and Namibia, also in a customs union, as well as the 5 East African countries that are in a customs union, and by the way, also the ECOWAS countries, which have a common external tariff, which is a customs union in all but name. Again, we would see as we move towards that stage of a continent-wide customs union that some coherence will be brought to this picture. I think we're likely to see a situation in a few years' time where we're looking at the RECs as building blocks of the customs union and looking at the coherence issues that would have to be addressed, much in the same way as today we're trying to address the coherence issues regarding the free trade area level. So that's how I would say it. And I think this also, in a sense, responds to the other question as regards, yes, countries can only be in one customs union, and this is what we have for the time being, ECOWAS, EAC, and SACU. But yes, we would expect to see some convergence and coherence when we move to the stage of the customs union. The issue of South Africa not having signed up, For a number of countries, what was explained to us in Sharm el-Sheikh, and I think Zodwa would be in a better position, is that before signing, there are certain legal processes that have to be followed at the national level. So for some countries, those processes need to be completed before they sign. I don't know if South Africa falls into that category, but South Africa has been a driving force behind the negotiations and obviously stands to benefit. And I've not heard anything to the contrary about South Africa's commitment to this TFTA as well as the CFTA. So I think I'll stop there. I think I've tried, perhaps not completely, but I'm sure that Vinay can round out what else needs to be said.
Vinay, feedback?
Thank you, Chair. Actually, I have I have more questions than answers myself. Just to start with the comment about the elite capture, nice term, I should say. That is what I feel is happening, actually. This issue of polarization and the asymmetries and the small economies not really participating and benefiting from regional integration. The question is, as a regional bloc, and I think Zodwa, you were saying that development is very much the focus of the regional integration, the TFTA process, the CFTA process. But one way in which the development aspect is captured is through, I would say, a chapter in the agreement on development cooperation, on aid, intra-regional aid. I mean, do we have that? As far as I know, I haven't seen it. This issue of development cooperation. And then what happens then is you have the question of asymmetry, countries that are not at par, and they feel being left behind in the process, and they feel that there is no sort of aid being given to them to help to sort of lift them. I know that, for example, in the SADC you have, and that ties up with another point that I want to make on this issue of industrialization, because one of the reasons why some of the smaller countries are not able to benefit from regional integration is precisely because they are mostly commodity producers and exporters, okay? And therefore, really very little scope for them to be engaging in exports of processed products. And that is because of the low level of industrialization. What can be done to really push this? Now, in the TFTA, you were saying that you have one sort of whole set of provisions on industrialization. I understand that in the SADC also, I can't tell for the other recs, in the SADC you have this, you also have this industrialization strategy, SADC industrialization strategy. The question is, again, and that goes back to the point that was being made earlier, a lot of speeches, lots of announcements, but when it comes to action on the ground, that's where I feel we are really missing out. So the question is, are those industrialization strategies being implemented? Is there a sort of a mechanism at the level of the REC, along with aid and investment and the whole cooperation mechanism that allows these strategies to be implemented? The way I see it, and I would want maybe David or someone else to correct me on this, I feel that is just not happening. That was one point. And very quickly, on the question of, I think the 5 layers were, you raised this issue of 5 layers when it comes to South Africa. There's another one, the TCDA, the Trade Cooperation and Development Agreement that South Africa has with the US. So it's more complicated, actually. And it becomes even more complicated when you think about this issue of customs union, which is happening next, according to the milestones, the Continental Customs Union. The question arises, and you made a very good point, you can be a member of only one customs union. The question then is, when you take the EPAs, and I'm just taking one example, okay? The EPAs, you have at least 3, 4 of them in Africa, and they have their own rules of origin, yeah? Now, when you go towards the Continental Customs Union and you were to adopt a common set of rules of origin, what would that be? And how would that conflict? To what extent will those rules of origin conflict with the EPA rules of origin? So I see bigger challenges, and I feel that we are not discussing those challenges enough. Yeah, let me just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, for the response to the many questions that have been raised. Unless there are... David, please.
Yeah, I think in the interest of debate and not getting into groupthink, it's, I think the points that Vinay has raised deserve a response. And, my response will be the following. Firstly, the last point as regards the rules of origin that have been agreed in the EPAs and what would happen. Will these collide with rules of origin when the CFTA is finalized and adopted? I think, again, this is where, somehow when it comes to Africa, it's as if Africa is different or something is funny. But, this happens all the time. You have FTAs that concluded with other partners. ASEAN has with Japan. ASEAN has with China. And all of these agreements have different rules of origin. And then you have the ASEAN one. So I don't see anything strange in that. I think that's normal, that Africa would have its internal rules of origin, and then it would have rules of origin that are applied with external partners in external agreements, like any other FTA. So I don't see the problem there. Vinay raises an important point as regards compensatory mechanisms, development cooperation within the region, and so on. We're dealing with 33 LDCs, very poor country. We're dealing continent, despite the Africa rising. The reality is still poverty. It is rising, but the reality is still there. And, I don't see for the foreseeable future, although COMESA, with the help of development partners and to some extent in the other RECs, have managed to put together funds for inter-regional transfers and so on. But, quite frankly, I don't see that as something that is going to come to the fore. And that is why I think the liberalization schedule should actually be cautious and sensitive to the small countries insofar as what they can see for the immediate future. I'm very sympathetic to that idea, that yes, the liberalization schedule is unambitious for many of the small countries, and the big countries are insisting on reciprocity. Egypt, South Africa, Mauritius, etc., insisting that yes, we can give you 100%, but we want reciprocity because they know the benefits. Again, I think in this kind of developmental context, much of what is not possible here at the WTO, as regards S&DT, we need to look to see how we can make it possible at the regional level. Again, so I don't see a problem there. Of course, the development cooperation transfers, those are, as I say, are going to be a challenge. As regards what is happening on industrialization, yes, indeed, the programs are there. But again, it's not like nothing is happening. The announcements are being made. One of the areas of work that we're seeking to advance in the Africa Trade Policy Center is actually to monitor what is actually being achieved as regards, not only on the industrialization pillar, which has its own program, the IDA, the African Industrial Development, something else, the agenda or whatever. And you have the CADAP on the agriculture. You have also for the infrastructure, you have the PIDA, I think is the acronym. So you have all of these programs, and yes, indeed, a lot is happening, but they're not being properly monitored, and the data is not being properly collected, and we see this as an important role. NEPAD, to some extent, has responsibility for some of this work and is actually undertaking some of the monitoring work that needs to be done. But it's very clearly there's a challenge to extend it so we could have a better sense of what is happening under these programs. But I don't think we can sit here and say that these are just grand declarations and nothing is happening, because that is not correct. It's simply not correct.
Thank you, David, for that clarification. Zodwa, I'll ask you to make your remarks, and then I'll ask Deborah to offer some. No? All right. Zodwa.
Thanks, Darlington. Just two issues that I want to intervene on. Vinay asked about cooperation in development and trade development. Phase 2 of the negotiations will deal with trade and services, intellectual property right, competition policy, and other trade-related matters. That is where the issue of cooperation will come in. The TFTA has recognized that, so it will be addressed in the Phase 2 negotiations. And then the issue of the customs union, what will happen to those countries that are already in customs union, the legality of it. That is why you have the EAC negotiating as a bloc, SACU negotiating as a bloc, because they want to align their common external tariff to what they are going to offer in the TFTA. So I don't think there will be any issue there, so long as those tariffs are aligned. And I think there was an earlier question which David partly answered. What will happen to the regs? The regs have a wider mandate than what the TFTA is focusing on. You've got issues of peace and security, which they will continue dealing with, infrastructure development. So I think what we should look at the CFTA and the TFTA to be addressing is the issue of the overlapping membership, to say, can we have one trading regime as Africa? I mean, like you have in the EU. I used to be amused driving from Netherlands down to Spain, where trucks just go through without being stopped. But that's not the case in Africa. So I think it's upon us, the current generation, the policymakers, to say, if the EU had done it before, the US, okay, it's one country. Honestly, we can remove all those barriers that we have created among ourselves and create a much larger market. It is possible. It can be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Zodwa, and thank you for other colleagues for contributing from the floor. As Deborah had stated, and in conclusion, I must say that you know, the objective of this dialogue was to recognize that there's development happening in Africa in terms of regional integration. Not much was being talked about, and considering that at ICTSD, we consider that regional integration in Africa is essential to sustainable development. It was therefore essential for us to organize such a dialogue to inform the Geneva community on what is happening on the continent in terms of regional integration and what this means to the trading partners and also the private sector. This discussion will not end here. We plan as an organization to go to the REC level, SADC, EAC, and engage them to understand what these various developments mean, what the global developments such as EPAs and the emerging economies and so forth, how they are impacting on regional integration. So this is ongoing work on our end. And on that note, I would want to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for making time to attend this event. I specifically want to thank our partner, the Netherlands, for sponsoring this event and continued support to ICTSD programs. So, dear colleagues, panelists, I thank you. The last point I need to make is that there are feedback forms on each of the tables in front of you. Please just take time to fill up. It's a very simple form. We want to hear what you think of this event. So thank you very much, and good evening.